Welcome, everybody, and especially the Astrological Association of Great Britain, President Roy Gillett, to this new episode in our series, Archetypal Cosmology. On our homepage, where this interview will be posted, we will give you some historical background. And what might be interesting for now is that Charles E.O. Carter was a rather important person. He founded the journal Uranus, and especially important is that he, together with Margaret Hone, founded Faculty of Astrological Studies in London in 1948, and 10 years later, the Astrological Association of Great Britain, where the President Roy Gillett is now our today's guest. Now let's begin with the life of the astrologer Roy Gillett when he was 10 years old. Roy, 10 years old, you wanted to become an astronomer, I believe, was written in this book of yours. I show this in the camera, and it's called Astrology and Compassion, the Convenient Truth of 2007, I believe. And there in the first chapter you wrote, when you were 10, you wanted to become an astronomer, and later on you realized what you really meant. The floor is yours.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, particularly important when we look at astrology in the modern world. And I thought it might be helpful if I could. In fact, I think you've got my chart there, haven't you? I wonder if we could hold that up in front of the camera, and if it's viewable, could you just put it up there so people can see it there? No, I don't know if that's viewable or not. Yeah, okay. If you could hold it for a moment, Volker. If you look at that chart, you can see that there are 4 planets in Aquarius, with Sagittarius rising, and the North Node on the ascendant. And that ascendant is trined by Mars and Saturn from Aries. Also, the Aquarian bunch, Mercury, Jupiter, Sun and Venus, are trined to by the Moon in the 7th house in Gemini. And you can see if there ever was a chart of an astrologer who wanted to counsel people, 7th house Moon, about his knowledge, this is clearly it. It's not just about science, it's about a science that's about relationships and how people work in the world, and a person who wants to teach about relationships. And if I'd known about astrology as I was a young man, it might have made the first half of my life a lot easier. Thank you, Volker, that's all right. I think people can see that. The reason I mention that is because the first thing that happened was that I saw the planets moving around the sun. I saw a diagram of that roughly about the same time that I saw a diagram of the way that the atoms work, the way that you have a nucleus and electrons. And it seemed, to my simplistic young mind, it seemed there's a lot of similarity between these two things. There must be some sort of connection. And yet, if you look at the textbook for astronomy, for what the British O-level examinations it was in those days, it's called GCSE at the moment. If you want to study astronomy, which is the only subject that's really available in this area, there's an introduction at the beginning that says, for heaven's sake, don't study astrology, because that's a complete deception. Okay. And it's not real. It's old-fashioned. It's out of date. Old astrologers, older people centuries ago used to study astrology, but now they've grown up and they realise it's just astronomy you ought to study. The physical makeup of the heavens, nothing to do with its relationship to us on Earth. And of course, I didn't understand all this in those days. I just saw that astronomy was a subject I might study, but it was just about the mechanics of the universe. And you could see from that chart I showed you that I really wanted all through my life to be a person who was doing things for other people and had a scientific and systematic way of wanting to build relationships with other people.
Not so fast. We are still in the age of 10. What did you do when you were 10? You're going to school, I suppose.
Well, yeah, but the whole point is that from this point onwards, this is the reason I say all this, is that this caused a gap in my consciousness, or in the potential to express my consciousness, as you can see through my chart, that dominated the next 30 or more years of my life.
Okay, and what happened in those 30 years? You went to school, and in England, for our visitors from all over the world, with this internet, tell us a little bit about the school system you went through. The first school is primary school, I believe.
Yeah, certainly. Well, I passed what in England was those days called the 11 plus and went to grammar school.
Okay.
And I was the only child, so I had no brothers and sisters. I was in a boys' school, and therefore I just submitted to the culture of that school.
Was that typical in your days in England, boys separated from girls in schools?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And, the thing was that it was a very traditional school. It was almost modelled on a pretty public school system with a authoritarian prefect system, corporal punishment, but lots and lots of out-of-school activities in sport and culture, like every year I was in the house play and the school opera, and I used to play rugby for the school and used to run for the school and swim for the school. And I was totally a sort of a grammar school enthusiastic, ordinary boy growing up, you know.
When you said grammar school and you passed this term public school, what I understand is in England the public schools are in reality private schools.
Exactly, yeah, they're the paid.
And your grammar school, and you compared your public school called grammar school in the curriculum and in the way and the style.
Yeah,
it was resembling public school structures, but it was a public school you went to.
Yeah, it was actually public in a literal sense, but in how we give it name things in Britain. The history is that public schools, as they're called, were originally founded for middle class kids, but in fact they become more and more the province of the privileged classes in Britain, and therefore the ordinary state schools, as they're called, which is the grammar school was a state school, but it was modelled. It was for kids who are a bit cleverer than other kids, you know, or supposed to be a bit cleverer than others. So, I mean, that is the background. And therefore, when I reached puberty and started relationships, I had absolutely no experience of girls or women. My parents were very kind, but very formal type people.
We have you consider you are born 1938.
Yes.
And when you became puberty teenager, 17 years old,
yes,
the morals and the instructions by teachers and parents were totally different from what is normal today.
Yeah, there's an absolute gap about the idea of sexuality or understanding sexuality. I mean, in the American cinema, man and woman were not allowed to sleep in the same bed when in the films. Yes, they always were in twin beds. Even the most loving relationships.
And if young people not being married went to a hotel, that was a crime, wasn't it?
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, the idea of having a child out of wedlock and things like that, it was all, and of course homosexuality was illegal and everything else. So there was a tremendous gap between contact and understanding and the head of a teenage boy who'd always been brought up in that kind of environment.
But then, if I go back to your book, in the first chapter, you're talking about sort of the storm of sexuality took over. Was that right?
So say again.
The storm of sexuality took you over, and
yeah, exactly. Well, that is the whole thing, and so one had to then learn about tactile and emotional experiences, not only between men and women, between men and everything, you know. I mean, even the rugby games we used to play, the boys used to sing songs that were taught by the older boys, which were considered to be sexually outrageous in the modern world, you know. Disgusting songs were sung after the match. And this whole gap between genuine sexual relationships and genuine personal, respectful relationships and where I was brought up is unbelievable. And
basically what you were a typical product of the time, a normal young boy, nothing with astrology so far. And the end of the grammar school, what's the final exam called? Is there a name for the exam when you finish grammar school?
GCE, General Certificate of Education.
And after the grammar school, where did you go from there?
Well, what happened was that I was heading to become a barrister or something with Latin and maths and all that sort of stuff.
Colleague of mine, you wanted to become a lawyer.
Yeah. Well, I didn't actually want to, but looking back on it now, if I'd have carried on and really worked hard for my examinations and stayed on at school and taken A levels, I would. These were the more advanced 18-year-old class exams. I would have ended up as a barrister, I think, with the kind of chart I've got. But in fact, I fell in love at the age of 15, left school at 16, and just fiddled. I became a self-taught person after that.
Not so fast. Does that mean that you didn't go to the final exam of grammar school? Or you dropped out?
Well, no, I didn't drop out completely. I took the 16-year-old, which was the year you would leave normally, but you could stay on for another 2 years and take the 18-year-old exam, in which case, obviously you would then go to university. I didn't do any of that.
So in Germany, the 16-year would be the German term Realschule, and the 18-year would be the Abitur, which is the entitlement to study at university. That's the same structure as in Germany. So you went out of school after the exam of 16 years. What did you do then?
Well, my uncle had a leading role in insurance brokering, so I ended up becoming an insurance clerk for 2 years.
Okay.
And then I went into it was those days we had national service. So I did a 2-year training as a wireless operator in the Royal Air Force, the British Royal Air Force. The second year of my...
not so fast. We are close in the wartime, isn't it? 1938?
No, this was 1954 to
54, yeah.
56.
Yes.
It's after the war. I spent a year in Butzweilerhof near Cologne in Germany.
Oh, okay.
I was at that centre. I think that's is now a German Air Force base, but in those days it was a Royal Air Force base, and came back to insurance for a year or so, and but while I was in Germany in Cologne, I visited the British Library, the British Centre, and started really studying books. And what had happened between leaving school and coming into the Air Force, that 2-year period, I read all the works of George Bernard Shaw and many other writers. And then when I got into the Air Force, I became more and more interested in that in my spare time. And so when I came out of the Air Force at the age of about 21, I thought I was going to be a writer. And this is where we come back to where we started. I'm starting to try and discover what the real purpose is, the gap that there'd been in my life, in my consciousness, because of what was offered in my education. That gap started to be filled as I tried to become a writer.
To make clear,
hours and hours writing.
When you're talking about reading a lot of books, in the first chapter, you describe how many authors: Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Shakespeare, and you read all Shakespeare. Did I understand that right?
I read a lot of I read a lot of Shakespeare, but that came a bit later because in the end, I gave up insurance and became a trainee teacher, and I studied. And although I had only got O levels, I only left at 16, I was able to show the college that I'd self-taught myself so well that I was capable of studying for a teacher training course.
So in your country, that is something to circumvent the second exam after the age of 18.
It's not possible now. It was possible in those days. It's not possible.
It's a special approach to become a legitimate study of higher education and become a teacher.
Yeah. It was a special arrangement for mature students, which they wanted at those days. I don't think you could do it today. Okay. But I got after a 3-year training course in English and drama, or in English actually, speciality. I became a teacher. And there I studied, of course, sociology of education, the philosophy of education, the psychology of education, and English, and appeared in produced a number of plays at college, and generally caught up with the education I'd missed by leaving school at 16.
Okay, and what year are we now?
We are now, the years I was at college, 1962 until 1965.
So you are in college when the flower power revolution started.
Yes.
Did you see anything of that in your college? And where was
Well,
your college? What
it was
college were you in?
it was more that the flower power thing really, it was starting in San Francisco about that time, but it really, I mean, I remember it more as Hank, what's his name, and the Shadows, and Cliff Richard, and Elvis
Yes.
Presley, and yeah, I mean, Elvis Presley was really my teenage years, you know, but and a bit later, but I didn't become aware of the flower power until I started teaching.
Oh, okay.
And the interesting thing was, in the late part of the 60s, there was this eruption, you know, the summer of love and everything else. But I was looking at it as a respectable school teacher, not so much from the point of view of an alternative society. And, you know, so I knew about it. And I began to slightly being affected by it, by seeing what was changing in the world around me, but not completely understanding it at that stage.
And what college did you do this teacher's exam?
It was Brighton College of Education, or it's called
Okay.
Brighton Training College in the days I was there.
Okay. And from Brighton to what school were you appointed as a teacher?
You know, I went to a school in Brighton, a secondary school in Brighton,
Okay.
and there I was there for 5 years.
And
then
what subjects did you teach?
English.
Only English.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So 5 years later, that's 1967?
No, well, no, I left in 65 and became a teacher in 65. And then for 5 years, I taught at this in Brighton. And then I got secondment to go away for a year and transform my teacher's certificate into a degree.
Okay.
And I studied at Goldsmiths College for a year. And then I was awarded the Bachelor of Education degree.
Oh, so now you have reached the normal level of academia.
Caught up.
You caught up with academia.
33, I've caught up with the educational standard I should have had at the age of 21, about over 10 years late. And one should say that in my spare time, I was always very socially conscious. I was very much involved in the political and trade union side of teaching in Brighton, and also a lot of school activities. So I helped to produce the play at the school, and you know, I spent a lot of time sort of being very socially conscious. Even at college, I helped to support the Labour Party in the general election, 1964 election. You know, so I was very, very much into the idealism of being a servant of society, but I didn't yet understand, and this is why I gave my chart at the beginning. I didn't really understand the real method. You know, from my point of view, politics is only a part of social service, and the big problem with politics is very much based on selfishness, or, you know, the basic idea of economics is very greed based, you know, and you know, although there are very idealistic politicians, the basic driving force of economics and politics is misses the spiritual depth that's needed if you're going to have a healthy society. And I hadn't yet understood that. And so as I got to this climax of getting a degree, and then in the 70s getting quite substantial promotion as a housemaster in another school in Sussex, I began to see that there was something very seriously missing from the way that we were organising our society, and that you know, big changes were needed.
And this headmaster position in Sussex,
No, housemaster, not headmaster.
This is sort of president of the school administration job.
Well, no, what actually happens is, this is a school of about 2,000 children between the age of 11 and 18, and the school was divided into two halves, and I was housemaster, and the upper half was divided into four. and they were 4 houses. So it made it administratively possible. That meant I had about 250 boys and girls that I was responsible for, rather like the social side of their life, the career, how they behaved in class, how they studied, their reports. And I had about 8 tutors who worked under me to look after little groups of kids. And that's the social side of the school, not the academic side.
Is this typical for a state school having this sort of structure?
Yeah, it's not unusual. They sometimes do it slightly differently. They sometimes have horizontal organisation rather than vertical organisation, but that's the way it happens. So the kids I was looking after between the age of 14 and 18 years.
And how long did you stay in Sussex in this school as a headmaster?
5 more years, or 5 years after I finished my degree, got a promotion to this school, stayed there for 5 years. And increasingly, as I was there, I was in a kind of, if you see now we come back to the astrology, if you look at I found out about astrology in the early 1970s.
So that would be after your Brighton education.
After I'd finished my degree, I found out firstly about the I Ching in about 1972.
Not so fast. Not so fast. How did that happen? How did you find the I Ching?
There's a big gap, which I don't want to go into in great depth, but the whole period between 1962 and 1971, I had a marriage which with some children, but it broke down. Okay. And the reason it broke down, I realized once I got into astrology, was because I didn't really understand myself and the world properly.
Okay. So in 1971, you had already learned I Ching.
I came across the book I Ching in 1971 to 2, I'm not sure, and realized that had certain answers. And then I therefore started exploring, now we come back to it, the alternative community much more seriously. This was another dimension. Up to then I hadn't even considered that. You know, I hadn't understood what it was about. But now I started exploring the alternative community. And the first move was to come across the I Ching. The second move was going to a sort of commune in England to see how they organised their life alternatively. And from that, I came across astrology. And then when I came across astrology, I looked back on my life and began to understand exactly where I'd gone right and wrong.
Not so fast again. When you say I came about astrology, did you read a book or did you meet somebody?
Yes, right. Well, this is very interesting. I teaching in this is about 1972-73. Teaching in a school and being responsible for about 250 teenagers. It was quite a crisis when a part of my consciousness was I was the authoritative controller of the discipline of these boys and girls. At the same time, I was beginning to see that there were alternative ways of understanding them. And it was a real crisis, you know, in my mind, you know. And at one stage, it became quite overwhelming, particularly because I was separated from my family as well because of the difficulties in my personal life. And I went to see the doctor one day and to see if I could take a little bit of time to step back from this and really get myself sorted out, you know. And while I was there, I met somebody who said, why don't you come and see me? I've got some interesting ideas to talk about. And I went round to the flat to meet them, and they did my chart.
Was that a professional astrologer?
No, it was, yes, there always are. There are people who teach themselves astrology. It wasn't a formula, I do it for money. It was one of these things that you do for people in a social situation. You know, it was that kind of informality. But when they did this and they said a few words which cut right through to my understanding of myself, I thought, my God, these words understand me better than anything I've studied in my degree and my teacher training and all the books I've read. There's much more depth and understanding in these few words than there is in anything I know. And now I understand why my life has been as it is. And then I started studying it more and looking at transits, and therefore this is why this relationship was as it was, and this happened when it did. And I began to see, if only I'd have known and been able to put in perspective the experiences I've had through the first 30 or so years of my life when it was happening, I would have been a much more mature and stable person and handled things better. And for all the attempts to help the world and save it in my life as a teacher and as a volunteer worker in all sorts of areas, I would have been much more effective at it than I have been. And this brought me to a point of having to decide whether I wanted to be a school teacher and become a headmaster and have a leading role in education, or I wanted to give all that up and devote the rest of my life to astrology.
Okay, before we go on from there, this astrologer, the first astrologer who did your chart, was that an old person or a young person?
Oh, he was about 2 years younger than me, I think.
And if you look back from your knowledge of today, being the president of the Astrological Association of Great Britain, and you remember the way he was talking to you, would you say he was a real good astrologer, or was he just an important person for you, but his astrology was not that great?
This is interesting in that, yeah, in the end, I realized he had an incredible, profound understanding of a whole range of alternative and magical ideas. But in terms of the question you've asked, all he did was read a couple of keywords from a book. That's all he did. And this is what there is another book. You mentioned the book Astrology and Compassion, The Convenient Truth at the beginning of this interview, but there's another book that I had the privilege of writing, which is called The Secret Language of Astrology, which is an attempt to put everybody in the world in the position I was in when this happened to me. And what it is, it's an attempt in one book to make astrology accessible and meaningful to anyone who wants to spend serious amount of time. But it's a very colorful book, it's a very attractive book, yeah. And it's sold thousands and thousands of copies all over the world. But this was my experience, that the actual language of astrology was able to cut through and touch me clearly, yes, more than, you know, even though that person wasn't very wise and showing all their wisdom to me, they just selected the right words from a right book. And anyone can do that. The knowledge is itself very powerful.
For our German viewers, we recommend this book.
Yeah.
To start with. It's from Alec Howe, Uranias Kinder, die seltsame Welt der Astrologen. It's a book about to start taking astrology seriously. Now, after this experience with this astrologer taking keywords from a book, how long did you stay in public service in the school from there?
Yeah, well, about 3 years. It became more and more difficult. I began to see England, the British education had gone through a revolution from when I started at college in 1962 to the early 70s, where we are now. And they've been incredibly loosening. The idea of corporal punishment had gone away. The education was becoming more and more child-centered. And I worked out, I was in a fairly influential position. I worked out a way of approaching school that will make it much more community-orientated and make the academic side high-powered for those who wanted it, but not sort of a burden on those that didn't, and that everyone would serve the community in a complementary way. And I could see I was in a very progressive school for the state schools in Britain, and I was trying to see if there were ways of bringing that in. And at the same time, I had to control the students. And at the same time, I knew that the students needed to find their own way and didn't need to be controlled into a system that wasn't really suited for them. And so I spent about 3 years trying to see if there was a way of starting off a process of change in the British educational system. And finally, by 1976, I realized that the problem was that people didn't understand astrology and associated subjects properly. And until they did, we were never going to really regenerate society. And at that point, I decided to focus the rest of my life on astrology and not on the conventional educational path I'd been on.
That's 1976.
Yep.
You were separated from your first wife and children.
Yeah.
1976. You left a rather secure job situation with income. And were you rich, or did you have nothing then?
Well, no. What actually happened was that I had in 1975 met my first wife. This is like 4 years after the divorce of my first marriage. I've gone through a kind of later life adolescence for 4 years, and while I was still doing the teaching, and then I met my second wife, and we married, and she was from New Zealand, so we decided we wanted to go to New Zealand, and we did this journey. We got married and travelled for 2 years across the world overland to New Zealand. And through that journey, I kept a diary with all the astrological information for each day on it and comments on what happened each day. And so that was why I learned astrology, by living on the ground and surviving day by day, right the way through from through Europe and the Egypt and the Middle East, and right across through Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, India, and across to Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, and then into Australia, around Australia, and to New Zealand. So that really taught me a lot about astrology, as well as a lot about living in not just my country and being British, but being a citizen of the world, and it really opened my consciousness and prepared me for the rest of my life, which is why we're here talking to each other now.
Okay. And this journey started in 1976 or in 77 or?
The end of 76.
The end of 76.
About October I left. I got married in October at 76.
And how was the income situation? Did you do reading of charts to get some income, or how did you survive?
We pulled all the money we had. Okay. We had limited resources, and we lived very, very cheaply. Sometimes we slept out overnight. We often hitchhiked in quite interesting places. We made contact with people and shared costs of travel that way. Or we lived very cheaply in India. When we got to India, we were able to start doing charts for money. So we could survive in India. We could live on a day-to-day basis in India. But probably the most interesting story, which adds a little bit of colour to the kind of journey it was, we were in Afghanistan, and this is before the Russians invaded Afghanistan, when makes me weep every time I hear the word Afghanistan, because Afghanistan in 1977 was a reasonably happy country. It was a poor country, and I'm sure there was all sorts of injustices, but it wasn't in the condition it's in now, and the condition it's been in ever since Russia invaded and America interfered and we all got involved. But we were in Kabul, staying in quite a nice hotel, quite cheaply, but really running out of money, trying to make the decision as to whether we would go back to Iran, which was still in the hands of the Shah, and where we could have earned money as teachers, teaching English, or to carry on into India without enough money or knowing how we were going to get out of the country. And my teeth were quite bad, and I needed money to do my teeth. And we found out that we could sell blood at the local hospital. So we both sold half a litre of blood, and this enabled me to get my teeth done. And while we were there, we met this woman who had come from Dharam, or McLeod Ganj, near Dharamsala in northern India, where the Dalai Lama had in exile was living. And she told us about the place. And so we had to decide whether to go on into India, hoping we would be able to get out, or go back to Iran. And in fact, we made the decision to go on into India, following the spiritual answer rather than the practical answer. As it worked out, that was the beginning of my the actual earning a living as an astrologer. And if we'd have gone back, we'd have been caught right up in the middle of the revolution and all that went wrong with Iran when the Ayatollah moved in a few months later. So I started earning money as an astrologer in McLeod Ganj in Dharamsala in northern India in about when we were there, about May, started 1977.
And this is about the time when you met the Dalai Lama?
Not immediately. We were living in the place where the Dalai Lama and his people had moved to, the old palace as it was called in those days. We lived in a room there. It wasn't in the palace, it was one of the outhouses associated with it. And we lived there for 3-4 months and made a living by making cakes and jam, because that wasn't easily available locally, and also doing horoscopes for people. Okay. And we earned enough money to live and have some savings to carry on our journey around India in September. And in September, His Holiness had been overseas all the time we've been in Dharamsala, but in September we went through a rather magical delaying process and ended up being in the group that met him at Old Delhi Station when he came back through, as we were traveling through Delhi at the time.
Okay, now we have reached the point where people want to know, astrology is a broad term. When you start,
is a what? Sorry,
a very broad term. There is classical astrology, there is horary astrology, there is psychological astrology. When you started out with this first astrologer, when you met this rather young person, reading your key text words, and then you started reading yourself, I suppose. Do you remember the books you were reading?
Yeah. The words that I mentioned to you earlier were from, funny enough, Alice Bailey's Esoteric Astrology.
Okay.
And it was a description of my ascendant and description of my sun. It was, I think the first one, the ascendant, was I see a goal, I reach the goal, I see another one, something like that. Yes. And I forget the one for the sun now off the top of my head. I've got it written down somewhere. But like that was the first book. But the first book I really studied and how I taught myself astrology was the Complete Astrologer by Derek and Julia Parker.
Okay,
I don't know if you know that in Germany. I think you will.
Well, it's available in German as well. It's a rather large volume. You studied from page 1 to the last.
Well, that was the first one, and a lot of people. It was very popular in those days. I mean, I then studied a book by Ronald Davidson called Astrology, who was actually the president of the Astrological Lodge of London. You mentioned in the introduction that you didn't actually, I shortened you when you were originally going to say a bit more, but I shortened you too much. The Astrological Lodge of London was the first English organisation. It was founded by Alan Lee and Bessie Leo in the early part of the 20th century. Charles Carter became very involved in that and was important, but also Ronald Davidson was a very important figure in the Astrological Lodge of London, and he wrote this book called Astrology, which I read. And also there's a little book called, and this was very useful when I was traveling, the New Waite's Compendium of Natal Astrology, which had all the interpretation keys and a rough ephemeris and house system for, it's a little book, and you could travel with that and do everything on the road. It was designed to do that. And that's what I had with me when I was doing charts in India when I first started.
When you look back on your studies, the books you read, in Germany we had this revision of astrology by Thomas Ring, and it was he tried to go more into a psychological astrology. How about your books? Was that already?
Yeah, well, you can see that I'm coming from the British revival of astrology and the figures there. The other figure I should mention is Reinhard Ebertin.
Yeah, Reinhard Ebertin, German.
The combination of stellar influences.
Yes.
Now, that was another. That's what I also had that book with me. So I used to use that as a reference when I couldn't work out what this symbol meant. I would look at his interpretations. I would look at the Waite's interpretations. So you can see it's coming very much from a modern psychological approach that started me off into astrology, and it's what I was using when I was starting to interpret people's charts. I mean, I didn't use, although the Parkers was a very good introduction. I never much used their interpretation keywords because I felt it was too wordy. I wanted something succinct so that I could then develop it. It would get me to the heart of the meaning, and then I would develop that in my own words. And I used Ebertine and Davidson for that purpose, and Waits to a certain extent too.
And you never approached the Iranian astrology school, the Hamburg school of Iranian astrology?
Well, I'm on the edge of it with Ebertine, of course, but like De Witt and all that symmetry, that kind of cosmobiology, I didn't really find out much about that until I got to the other side of the world and went to a conference in New Zealand in the early 80s. And then I began to find out more about midpoints and 90-degree dials. And and I know in the continent, in mainland Europe, this is a very important subject. We don't do enough about it in Britain at all. It's one of our shortcomings that, although in America, a guy called Gary Kristen and Astrolager have developed this into symmetrical astrology, as they call it, done a lot of great work in it, actually. In Britain, it's in a very Cinderella situation.
So that leads to the next question. Being in astrology and advising people about their charts, the question arises, how about prognosis? What techniques in prognosis did you do in those days?
Well, this is a very interesting thing, because I think that, doing a chart, particularly when I got to the other side of the world and I was in New Zealand, I mean, you might want to talk about it in a minute, but the story side of it. But when I was actually professionally, when you're in Dharamsala at a flea market, sitting on a carpet doing charts for people, it's a little bit more informal, and your wife's doing it quickly alongside you. It's a little bit more informal than when you're sitting in a proper consulting room in Western society, as I was when we got to New Zealand in 1979. But so when I got to that stage, what was particularly intimidating was, oh my, there's all these very ordinary people who come from a very different culture to me, who want me to talk or are letting me talk about this intimate personal side of their life. These are not just travelers who are playing around and exploring ideas like it was in India. These are people who live probably quite narrow lives. And it was an incredible sense of responsibility to actually, the discrepancy between my life experience and their life experience, and somehow I had to get my life experience out of the way and concentrate on their needs. And it was incredibly responsible, and therefore how could I dare tell them what was going to happen? They would come to me, will I meet someone, will I get a lot of money, and how could I tell them that?
Well, did you do?
I'm building up the background for you. So I decided, I had started looking at it, and I know particularly that we know that squares, oppositions, certainly, maybe even conjunctions, lead to not so much conjunctions, lead to difficulties and stress, and trines and like 120 degree, 60 degree aspects lead to easy flowing energy. And sometimes people make a big mistake in saying trines are really good. Isn't it great? We've got lots of trines. And isn't it horrible? We've got all this tension, these oppositions. I'm going to fight you, that sort of thing. And of course, the wise astrologer sees that society, that buildings, that everything that we experience is based on stress and flow, is based on the structure of the building, which holds it up, and the ease of movement when we do things properly, that gives us hope that something good will happen. And on the other hand, if you've got all easy flowing and everything's going easily for you, everything's going to fall apart. And if you've got too much structure, you can't feel any hope or happiness in life. And it's the complementary nature between the two, between the stressful aspects and the harmonious aspects, that give the art of successful happiness. So now let's get back to your question. Prediction is to do with how well people understand this. If people are living a conscious life and really trying to make the most of every opportunity, then the outcome will be very different than if they're just grumbling and accusing everyone for everything that's difficult and grabbing and making the most and piling up everything that's easy. And, you know, so to try and predict what will happen to every person, just technically on the mechanics of astrology, is not only a fool's path, but a very dangerous path to misinforming other people. And we've had all sorts of things happening when I was first doing this in New Zealand, where some astrologers saying, people come to see and they say, oh, look, got Saturn in the 7th house, you're going to get a divorce. And or people saying that they shouldn't have this relationship or should have this relationship. My idea of prognosis has always been that you should guide the client by informing them of what they're confronted with, and making them wise about what they have available. It's like making a meal. You first will look at the ingredients and then you make the best use of them. And in a way, that's how I do my consulting. Now, whether you can predict on specific events, I mean, I do a lot of work on mundane. I don't know if you want to go into this in more detail, particularly on politics. And we could talk about individual political situations. I've argued that Hillary Clinton, for example, was very lucky to lose the election and Trump was very unlucky to win it. We should see if that's right. And the Brexit thing is amazing. The astrology of when, I mean, if you want to talk, I won't go on to this now, but you look at the astrology of when the vote was taken, when Article 50 was voted on and so on. It's just unbelievable, the astrology of it, and how a good astrologer could have averted all the problems that we've got in the world if they'd been listened to and their wisdom had come from listening to the astrology. So I'm just going on, but that's response to your prognosis. I don't know if it's too long an answer.
No, that's quite all right. We might come back to this later in a later part.
Yeah.
Now we are in Dharamsala, and I think they have started your Buddhist aspect of life. Is that right?
Well, it's very funny or strange, because I was living there. I was incredibly impressed by the Tibetan people. Not so much about Buddhism at this stage, although obviously fundamentally Buddhism lies behind it, was that I felt I was in the company of people who had the best of both cultures. If you think of the Western culture, our way of doing things, and the Eastern culture, the Indian way of doing things, and the Tibetan people seem to combine the two. You get the best of both worlds. There was a greater maturity in their approach to life, and yet there was a deeper spirituality than we have in our approach to life. There was a general sense of community. If they wanted to build a house, everybody would get together and build a house. They didn't go through a major discussion with the bank and all the rest of it. I'm sure nowadays they might do, but in those days, the community idea was to get the stuff together and work as a whole group to build something. And this is also true on so many things. So I was very impressed with that. But I didn't formally study Buddhism. I did meet a number of lamas. I met the senior tutor of Dalai Lama on 3 occasions, which was an unbelievable experience that completely changed my whole. It completely took my ego. Perhaps he never does get rid of your ego, but like my presumption of magical specialness that I travelled with was turned around by just meeting the Dalai Lama's senior tutor. Just the sheer presence of the man and the clarity of the man was unbelievable. And yet I never actually formally started studying Buddhism until we'd completed the journey around India, done Southeast Asia and Indonesia, and reached Australia, gone round the top of Australia, and come to a place called Sendereihe Institute in Queensland, not too far from Brisbane. And there is when I formally took refuge in Tibetan Buddhism, and that was in 1977 still, is it? Yeah, 1977. Yeah, no, I get confused. I lost that time. No, I think it was 78. It was 78. Yeah, in May 78. Yeah.
In your second year of the journey.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we were in Brisbane. We got to New Zealand in November 1978.
Okay.
And
so
I started. Yeah, go on. Yeah.
From Dharamsala, what was the next station? Was that India?
Sorry, Dharamsala. Well, after being in Dharamsala for 3 months, we travelled around India. We went to Nepal and back down and crossed down to Goa for the New Year 77 to 78. and then back across to Madras, and then we took a boat to Madras to Malaysia, then right the way up to the top of Thailand and back down again, and then we took a boat from Malaysia to Sumatra, and then we would drive straight down through Sumatra to travel down to Bali and back, and then flew to New Zealand, in Perth in New Zealand.
Okay. And if you go back to 1976, in the end of 1976, the journey starts. And in your book here, Astrology and Compassion,
Yeah.
you are writing that you wanted to meet astrologers to further your knowledge in astrology. How did you plan that? Did you make appointments, or did you just go there and see what happens?
No, well, no.
Where did you start? You came from England. Did you go to Europe first?
No, this was very much a pilgrimage, where I've got a picture somewhere of me with a big rucksack on my back, standing on the boat that's leaving England,
okay,
looking back at the White Cliffs, feeling that I probably will never return to England at that time. Going out on the world, realizing that what I tried to do to serve the world had not really been totally intelligent as I thought it might be, and realizing I had a lot to learn. And we were on a magic bus that drove you right across Europe to Greece, and we got off just before Athens and went to Delphi, and then traveled to Crete, spent 2 weeks on a beach in Crete, just preparing for what was a long journey, and then we got a boat across to Egypt, and then down through Egypt and Sudan.
And up till now, did you meet any astrologer up till then?
Why I'm mentioning this journey is that, and the diary, you have to remember that I mentioned earlier that I kept, because that's what we got together. We organised those 2 weeks on the beach, getting everything together for the journey. I was not wanting to meet astrologers, but I found myself on a pilgrimage where we would decide where we wanted to be every quarter day. So I wanted to be, for example, at one stage I decided we're going to be in Bethlehem for the vernal equinox 1977, and in Kathmandu, I think, for the autumn equinox that year, something like that. So the teacher was the experience of the journey, being conscious of the astrological facts all the way. The teacher became the journey.
So basically,
sorry, go on.
You looked up the constellations in certain places and what it did with you personally, and the teacher was the universe.
Yeah, the teacher was what happened as we traveled through the earth, along the earth, and each day things would happen and we'd see, and some days I'd actually do the opposite of what the chart says I should do to see what would happen, to experiment. And in fact, there's also a number of examples I'll give you of where we did that, and it's proved undoubtedly that we did it the wrong way, that if we'd have done it another way, it would have been a much easier day. And so gradually I was experimenting through that journey all the way to India, and even afterwards, we were experimenting with the world. It wasn't that I didn't want to meet other astrologers, but I wasn't in the situation to meet them. I was on a journey, I was on a pilgrimage, right? Or we were on a pilgrimage. And yes, when we got to India, I did meet, I didn't really come across, it was interesting, I didn't really come across any Indian astrologers on that first journey to India. That I didn't meet them as, and stay with them and that, except that I did visit we went up to Badranath, which is near the Tibetan border. And on the way at Depravag, we visited an absolutely amazing astrologer who lived on a hill in this place, very, very highly regarded astrologer, and we spent some time with him. But other than that, I was using Western astrology in India all the way, so I didn't really meet any astrologers until I'd already set up the Astrological Advice Bureau in New Zealand, and we'd gone to a conference, and there I met all these astrologers who were coming in from America, and Australian astrologers and New Zealand astrologers, and started to realize that what we had learnt in our 2-year journey confirmed what I would have learnt if I'd have read the books and talked to the astrologers on the way. learning astrology, I got basic books to start me off to know where everything was and what basic meanings were. But except for that, I'd learned a lot about astrology in the field, and it was confirmed by the astrologers I met at this conference in 1980 in Auckland, New Zealand. And that started me off on what I started doing in New Zealand to build up my career from there.
Going back to this Indian astrologer, was it a shock for you that he didn't follow the tropical rules but did the sidereal astrology?
This wasn't an issue at this stage, because this man, the big thing about that I learned about there was the status of astrology in India. This man was virtually worshipped by the community. People would come to him and fall at their feet and kiss his shoes, you know. It was almost embarrassing to be sitting there while this was happening, you know, being an old-fashioned Westerner, you know. And, you know, and I realized that astrology has that amount of value to this culture. And what value does it have to our culture? This is what I remember the first visit. We went on another visit to India a year or so later, and there I visited and spent time with a man called Manik Chain Jain, who was one of the astrologers at the conference in Auckland that I just mentioned. And then I started comparing Indian astrology with Western astrology. And the first thing that struck me, and this is a really important point, was that Indian astrology had been operating with an unbroken lineage of transference of knowledge for thousands of years. Now, I know there's some argument about whether Indian astrology came from Babylon or not, but even if it did, the tradition as developed had been developing in an unbroken lineage since, certainly since Babylon, and maybe who knows whether Indian astrology was working before as well. Whereas Western astrology, as far as I knew at that time, had really not really happened in the way that I understood it before the 20th century or the late 19th century. I mean, in those days, we're talking about 1981, 82. Nobody had, William Lilly had hardly been renovated by Olivia Berkeley. He was known about, John Dee was known about, but they'd hardly been really respectfully known about, just historical, strange historical figures in the past. Their real knowledge had not really been studied and regenerated by anyone in the normal astrological community. None of the work on traditional astrology had happened, and none of the work on classical astrology has happened. And one of the things that I felt when I was in India in 1981 too, my second journey, was we have to rediscover the lineage of Western astrology. And one of the most satisfying things of this latter period of my life, when I have been in a more authoritative and leading an organisational position in society, is to see how great work has been done to rediscover the Western tradition, the Western lineage. And the amazing thing is that it shows there is a commonality between Vedic, Indian and Western classical astrology. It's not the same term. There's a lot of different yogas and things like that. But when you strip all the cultural trappings, surface away, essentially it's the same astrology, and in many ways the same methodology. Like you have Vidaria in the West, you have Bhuktis and Dashas in the Vedic system. So, you know, this is very exciting. I go back to 81, 82. None of this coincidence. Today we have both the same. A lot of differences, but the basic heart is there, which is very exciting.
Okay, now after this first Indian acquaintance with this astrology, you did the rest of the journey with your diary. Question in between, you still have these diaries?
Yeah, well, yes, I do. Yes, yeah, they look pretty tatty.
but you never thought about publishing what you experienced day by day, a day-by-day book project.
Okay, let's just get the chronology right. We got to New Zealand in '79, and we left again in '81. Everything I was saying about my relationship with Vedic astrology happened on the second journey. But
Okay.
let's go back to '79. In 1978. I had just taken refuge, but I decided not to do a particular course, but to stay at the Buddhist Center. My wife was doing a real retreat. I decided to step back from that particular thing. We'd done a few other practices and retreats and that, but I decided to just take a week or so off. And I sat in a tent in another part of the grounds and wrote 2 months of, I transferred my diary that I've been kept for myself and wrote a 2 monthly with a view to publishing it. We then went, when we left the Buddhist Center, we went to a alternative village or town really called, I think it was Nimbin or something, in New South Wales, and borrowed a typewriter. And I typed out, it must have also been one of these things you can print. And I typed out a 2 monthly prediction for September and October. And when I got to Auckland, I printed it. Sorry, when I got to Sydney in New South Wales, I printed a few of those and also made contact. Someone gave a copy to a woman who was doing the all-night program on ABC radio. And we did an ABC radio thing for 2 or 3 hours with music and sound. And on this diary, which was an A4 rough thing, I've still got a copy of it, one copy. And then when we got to New Zealand, I started bringing it out as a 3 monthly from 1979 until the end of 83. And then from 1984, I brought it out as an annual from 1984 to 1990. Then I didn't do that anymore. I was engaged in other activities. So that was taken up by people I met around the end of the 80s at astrology camps in Britain. And that is now the Astrological diary that you can get, the most beautiful, incredibly popular diary that you can get, which they've enhanced and developed far beyond I could ever have imagined. But that now sells extensively in America and Britain, and I think in other parts of the world as well. Okay. So in a way, indirectly, because I wouldn't like to claim too much credit for this last manifestation. I mean, it's so much their creative energy and their ability that's made it. But certainly I was the original spark. My diaries were the original spark, and my journey was the original spark that went to the diaries. So it's quite an interesting sequence, that.
Yes. And when you were in Australia and New Zealand, did you get to know the people around this software program SolarFire? Because
the software program for what?
SolarFire.
Yeah, no, well, now this is an interesting story. When I was in New Zealand, after this contact with the conference in 1980 in Auckland, we then set up an astrological practice in Palmerston North called the Astrological Advice Bureau. And it took off amazingly, partly because I did a radio broadcast and the media were covering it and many people came. And that's how we were able to finance the diaries that started us off. And that also encouraged me to organise an astrological event at a very beautiful New Age centre in Taupo called Tahara Centre. And out of that came the request from the astrologers in New Zealand that I organise annual conferences for them. And so Caroline and I organised the annual conference in New Zealand for 1981, 82, 83, 84, 85. There's one gap. One of them was organised by some of my students because we were travelling. I think it was the 82 one was organised by, or the 83 one. The 82 one was organised by students. But we organised conferences for those years, so it became increasingly popular. I'm wondering if I'm actually answering your question here. I've started talking about that. What was the question you were asking?
When you were in Down Under, as we say, did you meet the people around the software program SolarFire?
Oh yeah, no, that's okay. So I organised these conferences, and yes, I met at one of these. I did the Astrology conference at Tahara Centre, and that's where I met Bernadette Brady and Darylyn Ginsberg as young, enthusiastic astrologers living in Adelaide, and they were a part of this conference. I also organised visits from working with the Australians. We had Alan Oaken, we had Robert Hand, we had Derek and Julia Parker as principal speakers at various conferences through these years. And so I got to know them as well. And by meeting Robert Hand, I started working with Astrolabe. Now, there's a big jump here, because in 1985 and to 86, we returned to England, partly because my father had died and I wanted to be with my mother and help her through that time, and partly because there's a possibility of publishing my diaries in Britain. And so when I got back to Britain, I was offered the opportunity to represent Astrolabe in Britain. And from that, in 1992-93, the people who wrote Solar Fire made contact with Astrolabe in America, and the programmer also visited me in England, and that was how Solar Fire started to be fully developed and distributed throughout the world. So it's grown to what it is today. And interestingly enough, Bernadette, the people who wrote and developed it were students initially of Bernadette when she lived in Adelaide in New Zealand, in Australia. And the last fascinating thing is that if you look at astrocartography, the Jupiter line on the midheaven chart line on my astrocartography goes straight through Adelaide. And I've never been to Adelaide, but it's been a very important part of my life since the early 90s, when we started distributing it and improving it and developing it and extending it into the product it is today.
And now you're back in England in 1986, was that right?
Yep.
And what happened there?
Well, it was a difficult transition from being one of the most recognized astrologers, certainly from the organizational point of view, in New Zealand. England is slow to pick up. It's not like America, where things become very exciting very quickly. England, you have to go through a certain process of initiation. So the first few years were quite difficult, because I wasn't known. Certainly wasn't known as an astrologer. But as I started developing astrological software, offering us, the original stuff wasn't Solar Fire, but Robert Hand's software, the Nova and Nova chart wheels and time graphs and the Astrolabe reports. These Astrolabe products were available alongside other products from other providers, and but I was distributing those in England, and then of course Solar Fire came on a few years later. And so after a few years of quite difficult getting to know people, and because I was distributing software, obviously giving lots of advice to people, to astrologers, on how to use software, and then Solar Fire came along, and but I became a member of the Astrological Association Council, as it was in those days, in June 1990, and after serving for 4 years, I became chair. 5 years, I became chair in 1995. And then when Nick retired at the end of the decade to focus on the academic side of his work, I became president in 1999. So after a couple of years of slow development, and quite a lot of hardship, actually, that's how my career in Britain developed.
But if you are now president of the Astrological Association in Great Britain, do they pay you a salary?
No.
How do you get income?
It's partly to do with well, it's mainly to do with the fact that there is I am paid reasonably well for the support and that I do with astrology software. Okay. And also, I mean, I do see clients as well, and I write books and get royalties and things like that. Okay. I live a fairly modest life as well. Okay. And there's some pension as well, obviously, because of my age. So because I don't spend a lot more than a lot of people, and usually when I travel, to conferences internationally, you don't earn any money out of it much, but you usually get your expenses covered in some way or other. Okay. I've found it's interesting you ask about money, but in 1976, when we pooled our resources, I'm frightened to tell you how little money we had when we left England, not knowing where we were going to go or how we were going to get. Well, we knew where we wanted to go, but we didn't know how we were going to get there. I've always tried to follow a path that if you do the right thing, the money will be available, or the opportunity will be available to support what you're doing. And except for a period of incredible hardship for a few months in New Zealand when we first arrived, this has tended to work for us. You know, it's like there is a kind of system in India which is almost religiously followed, it is religiously followed, that you don't actually ask how much you're going to get, or you don't even do bargains necessarily. You just do what's needed, and what's needed for you will come to you. Now, you can't just do that in the Western society. You've got to be realistic about the way you do business, but to a certain extent, particularly, you've got to judge in a way who's just in it for exploiting you and who's in it for serving the world, for caring for the world. If you, ideally, one would like to live and not ask how much you're going to get, but have it come into you. But you do have to be realistic and businesslike sometimes. But generally, I've tried to live my life on the more idealistic level, and so far it's worked. Since 1976.
So we have now reached your membership and later the presidency of the Astrological Association in Great Britain. Now, this is a good time. We could decide now to continue for another hour, or we could say we stop here today. And the next part, the inside of the Astrological Association, would be on a second interview. What do you
Well, quite honestly, although I'm getting a lot of satisfaction out of this and feel it's a valuable thing to do, I also want to get it done because I've got a lot of other things queuing up behind. And once I do a big job, my mind goes into that. And okay. I won't be able to even start on anything else if we do this in bits and too many bits and pieces.
So
in a way, I'd rather carry on. If you've got the energy for it,
no, I was just.
I'd like to get it. Don't misunderstand me. I'd like to get it done.
Okay, very good. Very good.
But at the same time, not because I don't think it's worth putting a lot of good energy into. Yeah.
Okay, so we are now at the second part, which is the insider of the Astrological Association of Great Britain. When you came back 1986, how did you get into contact with this organization?
Well, first of all, I made a contact with a number of astrologers. I visited the lodge. I made contact. I met Charles Harvey. Charles Harvey was a bit unsure. It was interesting because, in fact, in the event, my destiny has been to put into practice everything that Charles visualized in the 1990s. I mean, in the 1990s, Charles was trying to scan all the journals. He was trying to get all the recordings of generally available. He was doing so many things that he wanted the association to do. And he just didn't have the technology and the volunteers at that time to do it. And so when I first met him, it was strange because I'd really come in a way to take over his role. But the idea of that in 1986, I didn't think I'd done that. You know, this is what history shows, you know. Yeah. But in 1986, you know, it's always the same when someone pops up who's is the person you need to fulfill your dreams. You tend to be a bit defensive. And Charles was a little bit defensive to start with. And yet very kind and friendly, and as he always was, you know, he's a wonderful soul. And so I met him. We kept in certain contact. But I met so many astrologers because I was distributing the software. You know, I was helping them, advising them. And, you know, I had a reasonable broad knowledge of various types of astrology. And, of course, by supplying software, you learn a lot more. You learn about techniques that you'd never even have looked at if you didn't know that software had to do that as well. So I gradually got to know people and they got to know me. And from 1988, 87, 88, I went to conferences and had a stand at conferences to show people how to use the software. So, and I think in 1990, one year, 88, I think I was asked to talk at one conference, and then and what was it, 89, and then in 1990 I was asked to come on the board, and then I became a part of the community. That's how it happened, really.
And this association of Astrological Association of Great Britain, how many members today?
Today there's, well, it depends what you mean by members. We've got about 700 or 800 people who are full-blooded members paying a certain fee, but we have several thousand people who regularly want us to communicate with them. They're called associate members, you could say. They don't actually pay anything for that, but they're on our mailing list. And then, of course, there's all the people that come to conference which don't always, well, they're supposed to be members at conference, but they don't always sustain their membership. So for such a fairly small membership, we have a very big impact. Interesting, if you look at the chart of the Astrological Association, we have Saturn on the ascendant in Sagittarius and Jupiter on the midheaven in Libra. And so we have a very expansive global role with very limited resources. And it's always been so.
Okay, this Charles Harvey, the rather famous Charles Harvey, he got rich because he inherited some money, right?
I didn't know about that, but it may be true. I don't know. I really can't say anything on that.
I thought when I looked in the internet about Charles Harvey, he was sort of responsible for this donation to the now Sophia Trust, the Urania Trust first. Is that Charles Harvey?
Well, John Addy founded the Urania Trust. John Addy was Charles's predecessor as president.
Oh, so the money comes from someone nobody knows, and John Addy.
Yeah, no, okay, all right. Let's clarify that. There's two big bundles of money along what you're thinking about. The first one is the money that was given to the Urania Trust for the purchase of a building in London. The building was purchased in Caledonian Road, although the Urania Trust did sell that. Charles was connected with the Urania Trust, and even after he ceased to be president of the association, and but John Addy actually founded it. And then there's the Sophia Trust. Now, £1 million was given or offered to the Sophia Trust. A new trust was founded long after the Urania Trust, nothing to do with the Urania Trust, to bring astrology to academia. And that money has been spent partly on a course at University of Kent, but mainly on a course that was developed at the University of Bath Spa, and later the University of I get the words wrong here. Must check this up.
Lampeter.
It's in Wales. It's one of the universities in Wales. Yeah.
I think it's called Lampeter University.
Yeah, Lampeter, but I forget what the formal name is. But yes, okay. Lampeter in South Wales.
And Nick.
That whole operation, he founded it in Bath Spa with the development of the building and classrooms and everything. I don't want to say what happened at Whiting's not still there.
That would have been my next question. Why was Bath a disaster in the end?
The workings of academic politics, particularly as far as astrology is concerned, is open to question.
I call this in my book Astrology in Law. If someone from academia deals in astrology, that is sort of academic suicide.
Yeah, well, I mean, it wasn't academic suicide, but it was in the sense that a lot of money from this donation, this £1 million, went into developing what was, I think, a cowshed or something into something quite nice, and we no longer operate from there. Now, the logistics of how that happened, I wouldn't like to get into the legal responsibility of saying it. But I think if people want to find out what happened, they can check up for themselves.
Yes.
Nick managed to get it accepted by Lampeter as a distance learning degree. And this has been so successful that about a year or so ago, Prince Charles actually gave the awards, the degree awards. And there's pictures of Prince Charles and Nick, and some of his students have been generally available. So that's been a great success. And yeah.
Now, coming back to your position, it's not always normal that an association has long periods with one president. The Astrological Association is rather lucky, having very few presidents who serve for a long period of time.
Yeah.
How do you explain that? Because in Germany, it's not the case.
I know it is strange. I mean, excuse me. I'll just have to fiddle with my fire a little bit. It started with John Addy, and in fact, I mean, it goes back. I mean, Charles Carter was a leading, and Ronald Davidson really dominated the running of the Lodge of London, and John Addy was president for some years. Charles was president for 21 years. Nick was only president for 4 or 5 years. That's because he wanted to focus on the academic side. And I've been president since 1999, which is building up to 20 years. My present term ends next year, so I will equal Charles's tenure next year.
Will you continue?
Sorry?
Will you be re-elected? Or
I don't know. I wouldn't like to. You should never anticipate what's going to happen.
Okay.
It's due to unforeseen circumstances, that old joke. Yeah. I don't know. At the moment, I feel fit and well, but I'm 81 years old. You know, I was also chair of the Jamyang Buddhist Center, you know, the trustees of Jamyang Buddhist Center until the end of 17, but felt that I should not do that as well any longer. You know, I've been chair of that for about 10 years, but but at the moment, it depends very much on the logistics of the organization and the transformation that's going on. At the moment, the association is very keen to, we've got a couple of people leaving the board this year who've done great work, and we now want to not only get younger people, but it's very important to get younger people onto the board and to build the association to expand and develop in the future. And you know, there is this tremendous development and interest in astrology among the millennial people online, and the link between the traditional organizations and these younger people is beginning to happen and needs to be extended. My work with OPA, the Organization of Professional Astrology in America, was very much about giving an opportunity to younger astrologers to really advance things. And so I think that's one of the ways the future is going to go. And certainly I would like to see the association on its way to that kind of expansion and preparedness into the future. You know, at the right time, I won't be there. Other people will be doing the work, but I haven't. You know, it's that vague at the moment. What am I going to say? You see, at the moment, we've got all the journals that have ever been published since 1959. Anyone can read them online if they're a member. We've got all the correlation journals that published since 1968 available online. We got
only for the paying members.
Yeah, paying members at the moment. Yeah, we've got to earn a living, so we've got to live.
Yeah, but that's only 800 people.
Well, yeah, it could be, but it doesn't have.
You're not offering to look at certain editions for a certain amount of fee.
Well, the fee of having access to these journals is online is at the moment £35 a year.
Oh, okay. So there is a special offer for people who are not paying members.
No, that's all you've got to be. You'll then become a member of the association and get all the benefits and have access to everything I've mentioned.
Oh, you mean the total of membership fee per year is only £35?
Yeah, that for the journal. If you want to get access to correlation as well, it's another £16 a year. That gives you access. You get 2 copies. I mean, for £35. You get access to all the journals from 59 and the new ones coming up this year. There's 6 of them. For another £16, you get access to all the correlations and the 2 editions, the current and the next edition.
And if somebody wants to read the new editions in print, is that possible?
Yeah, you can buy for an extra. Well, we're going to increase this because it's too cheap. It's only 42 at the moment for the hard copy, but we're going to that'll be up to 49 very
Okay.
soon. And the correlation. The £16 includes people living in Britain. You get hard copies, but if you live overseas, you have to pay extra for the postage.
Okay, so that can be seen on your homepage, I suppose.
Yeah, you can just go there and go to the shop and find all that out. So, I mean, we have to pay people to do things. I mean, yes. The journal, if you look at the quality of the journal, we do pay the editor, we do pay the graphic designer, and we have to, because it's such a high quality work and it takes a lot of time. And therefore, what people pay membership fees largely goes towards that.
And this journal, Mountain Astrology, is that American or British?
Mountain Astrologer is in West Coast America.
Oh, that's American. Yeah. Okay, coming back to your presidency, 20 years, a long time. What would you say was the worst event in your presidency?
No, the worst event was, I don't really want to talk about this very much, was an attempt by someone to attack us legally and as a litigant in person, which is always very difficult because, you either have to be as good at playing legal games as they are or pay a lot of money to defend yourself to other people. And fortunately, we did manage to get expenses. You didn't make any money. We did get our expenses back in the end, but it took about nearly 10 years of my life worrying about it. So that was really difficult.
And what was the highlight of the last 20 years presidency?
The highlight. It's a nice one. I could think about that. I would like to choose the highlight.
Or you can give us three. Why don't you give, if you have 3 or 4, give us them all?
Yeah. Well, I suppose in 1995 was the first Astrological Association conference I organised, and what we haven't mentioned was my involvement with astrology camps and more with the alternative community. And I had done that through the 80s before I really got so closely involved with the AA. I was helping to organise an annual camp, which would have about 100, 200 people together in a field for about 10 days, studying astrology and doing all sorts of experiential work. And in 95, we managed to integrate some of the aspects of that. We had an astrological garden, we had astrological, we had an astronomer there showing people the stars. We had a fancy dress, we had drama and that sort of stuff. Integrated that into the more sort of formal side of conference life, with meetings and that. So that was really wonderful to add this element of freshness into it. And also with Nick becoming president and me as chair, we managed to ensure that every element, or as many elements as we could imagine, of the astrological community would be welcome to conference. So it became a cross-fertilization of every aspect of astrology, and it stayed that way since. So that was really exciting. The other one, the second one, would be when I became president in 1999. I'd had this vision from when I first got involved with astrology in the 1970s. I came across an that was the thing that inspired me to do my diaries, actually. I even forget what the name of it is, but a guy did a kind of diary, and in this diary in the 1970s, he gathered together a lot of predictions about the solar eclipse in 1999. I don't know if you remember that one.
Yes, I do.
Yeah, and I've in many ways, I didn't mention this, the part of my journey in the crazy mind that you sometimes get into in these kind of things. I was always feeling that the journey around the Middle East in particularly was very much about trying to symbolically invoke peace and tolerance and working towards this Grand Cross eclipse. Very much the feeling that this was going to be the end of the world. A lot of people were talking about that. And therefore, it doesn't have to be the end of the world. Like I was saying earlier, your prediction doesn't have to happen if you've got the right state of mind. So you're trying to bring the right state of mind. So when it came to the point that I'd organised 3-4 conferences for the AA, and we were coming up to 1999, we decided to go whole hog, and we were offered by the resident astronomer at Plymouth University, Percy Seymour, the opportunity to work together with astronomers and have a kind of joint conference under the eclipse. He started off with that idea, but the astronomers didn't agree with Percy. And although Percy was still there, the astronomers weren't. But we then had got ourselves committed to having an astrology conference, and we promoted it. And whereas normally each year we'd have about 200 or 300 people at conferences, that year we had 680 or something coming all over the world. And I'd have to organise this incredibly complicated conference spread across the whole of the Plymouth University campus, which is pretty spread out. People staying in all sorts of places, most people residential, you know. It was the most amazing experience to be able to do that. And I had to do the keynote speech, a Carr's Memorial Lecture, in front of 600 people, which is the most frightening and yet the most exhilarating experience. So that was very special. And then, of course, I should mention last year we had our 60th anniversary conference. The AA's been in existence for 60 years, and we've organised 50 conferences, and that was our 50th conference, 60th year celebration last year, which was incredibly successful and had all the modern technology that we didn't have when I started as chair of the organisation in 1990. So those are highlights, I guess.
When you are president of this organization, how is your networking with other organizations, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, America, Canada? Is there a network?
Well, yeah, this is a good question, and it's very much an important part of what I do. Now, the connection, where do we start? The connection with America goes back to this 1999 conference. Out of that, we did a link with the ISAR, the International Society for Astrological Research in America, which is getting stronger and stronger every year, actually. And we did sort of complementary conferences. That we were invited to their 2000 conference, and then as yeah, I'll tell you something else about that in a minute. But we started working with ISAR. Also, out of the 201 conference, I met the OPA president, and lady became vice president, and that started me visiting America on a regular basis for their retreats and events. And last one I was there was the end of last autumn. Also, I've been to other organizations, and of course in America they have these United Astrology Congress conferences every 3-4 years, or 4 or 5 years actually. And I've spoken at 1, 2, 3 of those, 8, 12, 16, yeah, 3 of them. And so a lot of connections with America. Now, in 2005, we organised a conference, a European conference, where we had some Americans coming over, but particularly this conference was quadlingual. It was in English, German, Italian, and French, and we had simultaneous translation between these 4 languages. And we organised that at York University and had about 300 or 400 people there. Interestingly enough, it didn't coincide too well with German conference organisation. So although we had lots of people from Austria and France and Italy, we didn't get the support we would like from Germany. I think that wasn't deliberate. It just so happened that it couldn't quite organise everything with the time schedule. But so it wasn't as successful as I'd like it to be. And because it wasn't successful as I'd like it to be, we haven't been able to organise another European conference since. And no other. I mean, it used to be done to a certain extent in Switzerland. With Claude Weiss used to do it, I think.
Yes.
And Green used to help. But that hasn't happened for a while.
The World Conference from Claude Weiss. I was in Lucerne in 2000 and in Basel in 2004.
Yeah. It was one. Where was it? One of the. It was in Switzerland. I was over into. It was one inspired me was Basel. That's right, the Basel one I was at. That's what made me want to organise the English one, which we did. Yeah, but we, you know,
Okay.
it hasn't. You need more support from everybody to keep it going, you know, and it hasn't come, so we haven't done it.
How
But I've
about
sort of, so I just say that I've also visited Serbia and also met people in Hungary. But
how about Bulgaria?
sorry,
Bulgaria,
I've
Bulgaria.
been to Bulgaria. I've been. I've had a regular contact with Istanbul, with Turkey, and I've been visiting Turkey.
The reason I'm asking about Bulgaria, do you have any connections to the situation that the government in Bulgaria is advised by astrologers?
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh, okay, good. Now I think we have we are good with the second part. Now let's go to the giants of astrology. My first question: in the history, we could take the English John Dee to start with. What about older? Do you have any references, astrologers, which are important for you personally? Their books, their writings, and their biography. Is Ptolemaeus important for you?
Um, one of the limitations, I'm aware secondhand of a number of people like Ptolemy, obviously, and the Arab I can never get his name pronounced right, but it's Arab astrology as well. I know the existence of these things, but this is one of it's a weakness. It's an area I haven't studied. We have Chris Brennan coming to our conference this year. He's going to do a whole day workshop on classical astrology. It's an area which I've heard, and I've obviously Ben Dykes as well, who's done a lot of translation, including from Arabic as well as from Greek and Latin. So I'm aware of the work of people who've translated from the original Westerners today, modern Westerners who've done it. I've never studied it in any great depth. My astrological foundation goes back to, as I told you at the beginning of my biographical section, how I got into astrology and the journey I did. And I just tend to collect, and also some study of Vedic astrology. I really did as best I could to support the introduction of Vedic astrology to Britain, working with Camilla Sutton. And all the people I've worked with, I've tried to enable their way of doing astrology to be given public airing and to be discussed and explored. So, you know, I'm very aware of just about every tradition of astrology, but I've never studied the ancient astrology directly myself, except by hearing about it in talks I've been to. Now, if you're asking, the essence of my astrology is what I've judged and found out to work by my practical experience of traveling around the world and doing thousands of charts for people, and seeing, and also particularly my recent work since 2004, probably even longer than that, but certainly since 2002, I've been doing the working with the planets column in the Astrological Journal and studying the state of the world against the astrological cycles we're confronted with. And I've learned what works for me astrologically is based very much on empirical observation, trying to get my prejudiced hopes for things to happen out of the way, and letting the astrology explain what people are doing and why they're doing it, and the alternative choices they have to have a happier or not so happy outcome, both from the point of view of the ordinary individual having a consultation and the whole world behaving as it does at the moment. And so, you know, my focus is more on mundane astrology. I've done some work with financial astrology as well, and personal consultation, rather than looking back to the origins. Although I still use, I mean, some of the ideas that come from Vedic or traditional astrology, and the whole idea of ruling planets, planets in full, planets in detriment, transference of planets and dispositors and all that sort of stuff. I incorporate that into my work. Long answer.
Considering mundane astrology, in Britain, there's one famous mundane astrology, very successful in prognostication. It's William Lilly.
Yeah.
What's your opinion on William Lilly?
Well, I don't know to what extent. Well, he's supposed to have predicted the fire of London, was he? I'm not sure, but you know,
and the plague. I think
yeah,
the fire and the plague.
yeah. Well, you know, I mean, yeah. I wouldn't say Lilly stands or fall on predicting those two events. You know, I mean, a lot of things happened in the 17th century. I'm and there was a lot of astrologers, and I'm in mixed feelings. I mean, I very much respect all the work, the rediscovery of Lilly's work and the re-establishment of traditional astrology, and the actual scholarship, the exceptional scholarship of modern traditional astrologers is unbelievable. I mean, it puts me in the shade. It's almost beyond my intelligence to completely be able to follow what they do. I can do it, but I don't practice it, you know. So I want to say that first of all. I think it's a brilliant system of understanding, but I think it went wrong because, I mean, this is where you get back to Kepler. You know, his basic idea was that we should study cycles, and it was cycles that were important. And the increasing emphasis on predictive horary. I'm not saying horary astrology is wrong or shouldn't be done, and it doesn't work quite often. But I'm saying is the obsession. Every time when you look at the history of astrology, you can go back to Roman times as well. Every time astrology becomes interested with prediction, fixed prediction, methods of prediction, it starts turning. Society starts turning away from it. This is to a certain extent what happened at the end of the 17th century as we built into the 18th, and Swift's attack on, forget his name now, this guy who said he was dead and he wasn't. But like these sort of things go wrong because people become more interested in prediction and using intricate methods for prediction. And the trouble with astrology is there's so many different ways of looking at a chart that you can make it prove anything. And you've got to somehow find some way of being objective about the situation. You've got to let go of attachment. We haven't said much about my Buddhism, but that's what's helped me, I think, keep a bit honest with my astrology, is because I have studied Tibetan Buddhism, you know, and the law of karma. But so I'm sorry, this is all about me answering Lilly, but what I'm trying to say is that although I'm aware of Lilly and his students and the incredible scholarship and brilliance of his work, it's not something that I just use that as one of my tools. It's not the essence of my motivation in doing astrology. Is that...
This reminds me of your book.
Yeah.
There are chapters about these cycles, mundane astrology cycles. Yeah. Question number one, why is it not translated into German?
Well, nobody's offered to do it.
Well, I know.
It's a self-published book. It's not, you know, the person who published this is a friend of mine. He's no longer with us, and he hasn't had the capacity to get it translated. It has actually, funny enough, been translated into Swedish. I think that's the only translation that's been done.
Who has the right? Do you have the right for the German edition?
If anybody wants to translate it into German, I'll be more than happy. Yes.
So you could allow that.
I've got complete copyright. Nobody's got the copyright of it.
So all is needed is a sponsor from anywhere in the world.
Yes.
Sponsor the cost for the translating and to sponsor the editor, the house, the book house. And then this would be available in German.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to cooperate with that. I mean, my secret language of astrology has been translated into about 8 different languages, but that's because the publisher wanted to distribute it everywhere, you know.
My personal impression is this book is very important.
Yeah.
And not having it in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland is a mistake. Probably whenever you meet somebody on your conferences, ask, do you have enough money to publish it in German?
Yeah, I know. I mean, the trouble with astrology is that astrologers are absolutely brilliant people and they write absolutely brilliant books. But they, except for people who are very influential and either in fashion or very influential or very special, they don't read each other's books as much as they might do. They're busy doing their own astrology. Yes. And therefore, as I say, if one lady came along and said, look, I want to translate this into Swedish, and did it, and she did it all at her own expense and everything. She's an absolutely beautiful woman. And I mean, I don't know if I'd expect anyone to do that for German, but somehow it has to be, somebody has to make the move. I'm busy doing other things at the moment.
Yes, yes.
I'm promoting a couple of other books I've written as well. But but yes, if any, I'm very happy. If it was in Germany, it'd be lovely.
I suppose what we need
as well, so,
need,
yeah.
we are both too old for that, but we need somebody 20 years old and starting crowdfunding and then getting this done.
Well, maybe, yeah. I mean, you know, it's. I think in all my work, I've felt, you know, all my life. You know, you look at my chart. Go back to the chart. It's Aquarius, 4 planets: Mercury, Jupiter, Sun, Venus. Sag rising, North Node on the ascendant, being trined by Saturn and Mars, and the Moon in the 7th house trines the Sun, Venus. This is a man who has a understanding of a very scientific and systematic and yet humane view of the way the universe works, whose ideas are likely not to be understood because the Moon is square to Neptune in the 9th house. So it's possible that the ideas will not be able to be understood completely in his lifetime. But the reassurance that I always have with my work is that I feel that as even after my life, when I'm dead, you know, it will be there. It's a marker of the 20th century, early 21st century. It's a marker that, you know, what the possibility of astrology is. The big problem with astrology generally is we tend to get trapped in arguing about the silly discrediting that comes from scientists who want to say, oh, there's more than one zodiac, or there's 13 signs, and all those silly arguments that I deal with, I think, in chapter 2 of that book. See how silly they are. But and astrologers get caught up in various techniques and systems, but the actual value of being able to look objectively at a chart of somebody like Donald Trump, or comparing the charts of Theresa May and Michel Barnier, for example, or looking at the date that they decided to call the referendum on Brexit, you know, all these things would, all the negativity that's come from these things I've mentioned would not have happened if we had had a wise understanding of the way mundane astrology and personal astrology and how these particular individuals relate to it. You know, it's such a tragedy that we don't have that. And therefore, if we can't have it today, and if the powers that be, the intellectual powers that be, are trying to smear us by not letting us have it today, then at least let's leave a rare record that can be used in the future. And that's what keeps me going and motivates me to work until the day I die on it, you know.
I think there was a sort of a closing statement. I thank you very much. We will talk a little bit later after we close this session. So thank you very much for this very long interview. And I will show this book again when I close the recording.
Thank you.